Well, good morning and welcome to today's edition and episode of the Walking with God podcast. My name is Scott Herview. I'm your teacher, and today we're going to talk about prepping versus relying on God. And I think this is a good topic as we begin 2025, as we get into the new year. We got a new administration coming into our government here in the United States. Probably going to be the first time in a long time where one political party has complete control of the Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. And we just don't know what's coming. So there's a lot of preppers telling us what to do. There's a lot of, you should be prepared for this. What if we go to war? What if we have an EMP? We got the hurricanes, tornadoes, and everything. But I also want to talk about when does it go too far and we stop relying on God? Take matters into our own hands and we stop relying on to the one who provides all the provisions, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ. So we're going to talk about prepping today, and I want to give you a little bit of a backstory in my life about my journey of prepping and why I do not do long-term prepping. And here's the reason. So the backstory began, I was working at a local store, big box store, and if you're here in the United States, you probably heard of Tractor Supply, which is like a farming store. If you're here in New England, you heard of Ocean State Job Lot, which is kind of like an all-around store with discount prices. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Bass Pro Shops or Cabela's, which is an outdoor store, hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, and the likes. So the store that I worked for at the time was kind of like a Tractor Supply on steroids. So we were bigger than Tractor Supply. We were kind of like a Job Lot, and we were like a mini Cabela's. And what I would do is I would take a small portion of my paycheck every week and buy things that I thought I needed, and also I would go to the local antique shops and buy things that I thought were needed. So we'll start with the local antique shops. I would go in looking for tools that were old, vintage, that were hand forged or basically made with hardened steel, because if you bought tools lately, I believe that your screwdrivers and your pliers are being made with aluminum instead of steel. They break the first use, they get all stripped out. So I would go to the antique shops, buy the older ones, which would last a lot longer. Also, like I said, I would take a small portion of my paycheck, and at the store that I was working at, I would buy some supplies. I would also go to Dollar Tree and buy supplies, whether that be medical supplies like bandages, band-aids. Still need to get some hand and foot splints. I got ace wraps. I got some antibiotic cream. I've got, candles that I had bought. I've got an old, actually it's a brand new oil lamp and about a gallon, a little more than a gallon of lamp oil for it and such. So, and also, I don't know if you can see up in the back over there, but I do also have quite a supply of cast iron cookware. I prefer cast iron over the aluminum stuff that they put out nowadays. It just lasts longer. You can restore them back to new and such. And I figured if ever we did have a power failure, I could always use that on an open fire. So my prepping started probably back when I was in North Carolina and down in Florida. We would have ice storms that would knock out power for 8 days. I lived out in the country. And during one ice storm, as much as my neighbors, you've heard the term redneck and hillbilly, I was really surprised how unprepared they were for living out there, and here I am, a New Englander, living out there, and I was more prepared than they were. I had a kerosene heater to keep warm. We were 8 days without power. I had charcoal out in the shed along with a grill. I was able to have a hot meal during those 8 days. Matter of fact, I was providing hot meals for my neighbors because they had no way to cook once the power went out. Also, with the kerosene heater and having a big, huge sliding door on the back of my mobile home. The sun would come in and radiate, and we'd get warm in there. So the neighbor's daughter was pregnant. She would come over for a little while to warm up. So I was surprised like how unprepared people were, even for short-term emergencies. So even when I lived down in Florida, I would always make sure I had extra batteries on hand. If we knew a hurricane was coming, I would check all my lights, check my batteries. I was living in an apartment. We had a pantry. I would stock up on water to drink, and then I would use tap water and pitchers and put those in the refrigerator in the pantry area. This way here, if we did lose water or the city water supply got contaminated from the flood waters, I would have water on hand to be able to wash up, brush my teeth, or whatever for my wife. So I was always kind of prepared for short-term emergencies. And I was a Cub Scout. Never got to be a Boy Scout because about the time I was going into Webelos at 10 years old, the leader decided he wasn't going to do it anymore. So I never transitioned from Cub Scouts to Webelos into Boy Scouts. But I do have a Boy Scout field manual from 1960s on hand that talks a lot about bushcrafting and emergency preparedness. I also have a mountain emergency, medical emergency book if I need it. So I was always prepared for short-term emergencies, and I was always be able to supply. So I got accused of being a prepper. And even when I moved back up north and I was working for that store that I was just telling you about, and I was buying some supplies that I would need for around here, especially for winter after living down south for so long, and I also got some work gloves and whatever. I got accused of being a prepper. They would say, "Oh, what is Scott buying today?" And I was always tell them, look, if you live in the city, chances are your power is going to be restored that much quicker than if you're living out in the country. Out in the country, you might have to fend for yourself. I do a lot of outdoor activities. I got to make sure I'm medically prepared when I'm outdoors. Should I get a cut or whatever, I always have to make sure I have water because my wife has kidney problems, and drinking tap water is not good for her. Not to mention some of the things that goes on with the tap water and the amount of chlorine and bacterial problems you hear about. So, I always have to be ready for short-term emergencies. So, what does the Bible say about being ready? There are a few verses I'm going to share with you right now. And while the Bible does not directly speak about the prepping that we do today, now you got to remember back in biblical society, they were all farmers. They didn't have electricity. They might have had like a doctor's office because we all know Luke was a physician, but they didn't have the modern medicines that they had today. So they always had to be able to take care of themselves as needed. There are some principles when it comes to being prepared that the Bible does talk about, and we're going to look at Proverbs 6 through 8. Now this one's out of the NIV. It says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers food at harvest." This verse encourages foresight and planning, similar to the way ants prepare for the future by storing food. Proverbs 21:20, "The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but the fool gulps theirs down. Wisdom is shown in saving and preparing, while the foolish is in wastefulness." Genesis 41, verses 47 through 49. During the 7 years of abundance, the land had produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. This is an example of Joseph preparing for the 7 years of famine, showing that wise preparation during times of abundance can protect against future hardship. Matthew 25, 1 through 13. The parable of the 10 virgins talks about they took oil for their jars, and when the bridegroom came along and they were all drowsy and sleeping, it teaches about the importance of being spiritually prepared, because if you remember, there were some of the virgins that did not have the oil, and they were begging for oil for their lamps, and then the other one said, "No, you can't have ours, we came prepared." Luke 14, 28 to 30. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you. And it emphasizes the value of planning ahead. And there are countless other verses. You can look these up for yourself. There's 1 Timothy 5 through 8, Proverbs 27:12. The prudent sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Wisdom involves recognizing potential dangers ahead and acting to avoid them. And then we also have 2 Corinthians 12:14 that you can look up, Isaiah 23:7. So prepping in a biblical sense is about being wise, diligent, and prudent. But here's the thing. When does prepping actually take away from your reliance on God? When does prepping go too far and you're pretty much considered on the borderline of being a hoarder? If you go out to YouTube and you look at the channels of various preppers and those telling you to prepare and to prep for what's coming, they're always doomsday alarmists. We could be at war, we could have an EMP, not have power for months, we're going to get nuked right back to the 1700s, and that's how we're going to have to live. So we got to be able to forage for our food and all that stuff. So when does it become too much? There was a time that I was preparing and I had forgot about my preparations, and I opened up and had a closet full of water. The containers that I had stored water in, the 1 gallon milk containers, for some reason had started to leak in the half-gallon one, so I had a closet full of water. The other thing that happened is I was going through my food supply, and when you're a prepper and you're keeping a lot of food on hand, unless you're using the backpacking meals that you just add the hot water, like the Mountain House, the Peak Refuel, and there's like a bunch of other ones. They're freeze-dried foods that have a shelf life of 7 to 25 years. If you use like canned goods and all that, and there's other foods that have a shorter shelf life of like only maybe 6 to 7 months, you've got to rotate through that. So you see a lot of preppers out there that they're saying, stack it to the ceilings, and they'll show their preps. They have tons of propane bottles with propane on hands. They'll have canned goods stacked floor to ceiling. They'll have the backpacking meals. They'll have tons of books and magazines, which as technology and everything changes, a lot of that stuff goes out of relevance unless you're like dealing with like bushcrafting and emergency preparing it that way. But it'll show them stocking medicines. Medicines only have a shelf life of 6 months, maybe to 2 years at the most, but it'll show them totally stockpiling that. So when does that become a hoarding situation and not relying on God? To go along with that, I was going through my food rotations and I found that I was not eating them quick enough. You pretty much have to not go out and eat and just rely on your rotations every time. And I found a lot of food that was getting close to being expired or had expired. With canned goods, you got to be careful if they start rusting or bulging. So long-term prepping, especially in the area that I live in, is not really worth it because right now, yes, I'm in a rural area, but I'm also kind of more of a suburb. So I can count on my stores opening and my power being restored in like maybe 7 to 10 days or a month. My mom always had a saying, if you have to evacuate, you can't take it all with you. So what good is storing floor to ceilings if you got to run and evacuate? How much money are you spending just on your prepping alone? So these are the things that we got to consider when we're prepping. Not only that, it takes up a lot of room to store these things, and once you store it, you got to be able to get at it at an emergency. You can't have things piled up behind each other. One of the real tragic situations with ultimate prepping and prepared prepping is not only are you taking your reliance off of God to provide you your provisions and turning your reliance on yourself, and therefore making yourself kind of like your own idol, being worldly, preparing for yourself, and taking God out of the picture. What happens when those preps become no good and now you have no faith and reliance on God? Couple examples that I am reminded of that would be recently with the wildfires that are happening in California, the Palisades, Eaton, and a bunch of other wildfires where they just had like minutes to seconds to get out of their homes, and all it shows all these mansions that are just like totally destroyed within a matter of no time. The other time I want to talk about also is during Helene. Hurricane Helene came in, hit Florida, and as you know, it went up through Georgia and the mountains of the Carolinas. And even though they were getting a lot of rain, once the soil got saturated and could not hold the water anymore, rivers of water came running down the mountains. A matter of seconds to minutes, there were people trapped up on the mountains. And if you saw what happened in the city of Asheville, literally the rivers had overflowed and all that water came into the city and it was up to the roof lines. It showed pictures of a lot of restaurants that I had been in, just like totally destroyed with logs and mud and everything just caked up, taking out walls, collapsed buildings, overturned cars. So within a matter of seconds, your preps can be wiped out. You can have nothing left. Then you have no choice but relying on God for your provisions, relying on God to be able to bring people in and provisions for other areas. So then your focus starts being taken off of yourself and put on God to help, because you can no longer provide for yourself. You're relying on God. And there are some Bible verses that actually talk about us relying on God. So the Bible speaks often about God's provision and assuring believers that He will meet our needs. And there are several verses that emphasize this. So in Matthew 6:31 to 33, we read, "So do not worry, saying, 'What shall we eat?' or 'What shall we drink?' or 'What shall we wear?' For the pagans run after all these things." Now, a pagan is someone who does not believe or worship God or Jesus Christ. So they run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows what you need. But first seek His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. We have seen during the flood and the wildfires. Now, you can say what you will on whether or not our government is doing a good job or not, depending on what side of the fence you stand on, and a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of things that weren't done right that led to these situations. But ultimately, God's going to bring relief. Philippians 4:19, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of His glory in Jesus Christ." So basically, your needs is not the luxuries that you have. Your basic needs are food and water for your body, clothing to keep you warm and protected, and shelter to keep you out of the elements. That is all you need outside your faith in God. Yes, it's nice to have luxuries, but that can go up and be gone in an instant, just like if you were an extreme preparer. And also, when does it actually lead into hoarding? Do you start collecting everything? There have been some preppers that I have seen where people have gone into places where there were preppers, especially if you watch like any of the off-grid properties up in Alaska, like called Failed Dreams, and you will see 10, 20 propane bottles that some of them still have propane in it, but the majority of them are rusted, leaking, have holes in them, stacks of magazines that had gotten wet, that if you look at, you can't even get this technology anymore. It's totally what's in those magazines, and a lot of those books were irrelevant, plus they were all wet and moldy, so they were of no use. Food like hamburger, hot dog, steak that was put into the Rubbermaid bins and kept cold. That the Rubbermaid bins are now full of water and all that spoiled. Same thing with your toilet paper, your paper towels, rags, all that is all wet and moldy. Canned goods that were bulging, exploding, and just a complete putrid mess. So when does it become a hoarding situation, and what to do about when all that starts to expire, starts to become no good? It says in Psalm 23:1, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." And that's true. Even the homeless on the street that you say lack, they really don't truly lack, especially if they're here in America. There are ways to get free health care. There's a way for them to get a meal. There's a way for them to keep warm. Some of them choose that lifestyle to live on the street. Some of them have mental illness, so they're not even sure. But when bad luck comes among them, if they know where to get the right resources, they can be provided for. So the Lord is your shepherd, and you lack nothing. And this verse reminds us that, like the shepherd to his sheep, God provides for every need we had. 2 Corinthians 9:8, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound for every good work." God's provision is not just for survival, but enable us to do good works in His name. So the other verses I'm not going to read through, but there's some more that talks about this. Matthew 7:9-11, Psalm 37:25, Deuteronomy 2:7, Romans 8:32, Luke 12:22-24, and Genesis 22-14. So one of the things I want to talk about also is, with having emergency supplies and having things on hand, we are also to be good stewards. Like I talked about things that I've done in the past, about like providing a hot meal for people, providing a place to keep warm. What good is prepping if you're not going to be a steward and you're going to be selfish and use that all for yourself? Some of these prepping channels on YouTube, the ones that are alarmists, will talk about how gangs will come in and steal your supplies. So therefore, you got to be heavily armed and protect those supplies. And yes, it's true. The more you have, the more people are going to want to come in and steal to make sure that they have their needs met and they're provided, rather than relying on God. These preppers talk about stocking up things for yourself, making sure your family is provided for first. Yes, make sure you're provided for and make sure your family's provided for. But the Bible also talks about being stewards. So in time of an emergency, we are to come to the aid of our neighbors. Any supplies that we have, we are to use to help out our neighbors in their times of need. And likewise, any supplies they may have, they are to use and help us out in times of our needs. And you see whole communities just banding together to help each other out in times of emergency. And that is biblical. That is something that we need to do. So we need to rely on God. We need to be prepared, but not hoarders. We need to rely on God's provision. God will provide, but we are also to be good stewards with our provision and help others. Like I said before, and like my mom has always said, if you need to evacuate, you can't take it all with you. All your supplies, everything I have in here, can be gone in an instant. Back in 1995, I had an apartment fire, the building that I lived in. The fire started in the apartment downstairs and ultimately went up into my apartment. In a matter of an hour or two, everything that I had gone. My stereo system, my DJing equipment, a lot of my clothes, a few photographs, a couple of VHS tapes of family memories, all my records, cassette tapes, CDs, some furniture, all gone in a matter of an hour or two. The floods that happened with Hurricane Helene in the mountains of the Carolinas, minutes to a second, floodwaters, gone, wiped out an entire city. Hurricane Milton hitting right after that. Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, various other hurricanes, Tornado can spring up in a matter of seconds and you have little warning. Hurricane, at least you have a couple of days warning that it's going to hit, even though in the Carolinas nobody was prepared for that hurricane sitting around and lasting. So it all can be wiped out. Where is your faith? Who are you relying on for your provisions? And what are you preparing for? Yes, it is to be wise, and the Bible does speak about storing up things for emergencies, but truthfully, in today's society, you only need to be ready for a month to a possibly 2 months or so, especially if you live in the suburban cities. Your resources will be restored that much quicker. If you live out in the country, I would say probably have about 6 months provision on hand for the ultimate emergency. Anything more than that, you're going to have to leave, go find provision somewhere else. Living off grid is great if it's something in your lifestyle that you want to do, because then you can develop ways to rely on solar power for your power and your heating. If you have a hot spring nearby, you can rely on thermal energy for heating. You can have propane for cooking. Some states still allow wood stoves and kerosene heaters, even though a lot of places are outlawing them now. That you can still get heat if the power goes out. You can still heat your house. You can still cook on your wood stove if you're still allowed to even have those wood fire stove and ovens that you've seen from back in the 50s or so. And our grandparents and our great grandparents were kind of also prepared with having root cellars and garden and growing their own food and be able to do that, and having basic medical supplies on hand, and basically learning for emergency situations and medical emergencies. So the Bible talks about we are to be prudent and all that. But the Bible also talks about those who had built their barns and built bigger barns and stored, only to have rust destroy and rats come in to eat all the grain. So because they took their reliance off of God and put their reliance on itself. Whenever you put your reliance totally on yourself, you are setting yourself up for disaster. You need to have a network of friends and family that will come in and help you in times of emergency, and that you can rely on, because you cannot do it all yourself. You're going to tire yourself out. You're going to frustrate yourself. So that's where you need to have your network of friends. You need to rely on God to tell you where to get your provisions from in time of emergency. You need to rely on God to be able to provide the stuff for you, bring the people in the right path. Many places in the Bible, God tells us that we're not to do it alone. We're not to live alone. And yes, God, when he came down as Jesus, did go into the wilderness to isolate and to pray. At times, isolation is good, but we are not to live an isolated life. Jesus surrounded himself with people all the time to be on watch. He surrounded himself with people for other reasons, and he taught how to actually surround yourself with the right people. So that's what we need to do. We need to rely on God. We need to surround ourselves with the right people, and we need to be prepared. But don't go overboard and be a ultimate prepper and take your reliance off God. Because as soon as you take reliance off God, you hurt yourself spiritually. We have free will, and God could, even though he loves us and will take care of us, he will let us suffer the consequences. And I've seen a lot of people on YouTube channels who were preppers and had, basically failed dreams and such, that they spent all their money on supplies and food and all that, and a lot of it just went to waste. So please, as we go into 2025, it's the middle of January, and this year has really not begun yet. There's still a lot of questions that are going to happen. There's still a lot of questions as to, whether or not war is going to come to our soil. Still a lot of questions on whether or not the economy is going to recover or totally crash. Still got to deal with, the effects of the last administration. We still, things are going on in our neighborhoods. Our country is still heavily divided. So we do not know what's going to happen in the future. And if we don't know what's going to happen in the future, how do we prepare? I mean, if war was to come to our soil and we don't know what that warfare is going to look like. Is it going to be a computer and cyber attacks like it already happened? Is it going to be a conventional warfare with tanks and guns and bullets? Or is it going to be an EMP that destroys all electricity and electronics? Is it going to be a nuclear warfare? How are we going to prepare? How do we prepare for something like that? Because we're going to evacuate. We don't know what's coming. So, yes, that's why I say prepare for 3 to maybe 6 months at the most. You always should be prepared for at least the next few days to a week in case a hurricane comes through, or in case a tornado comes through, an ice storm, a snowstorm, or you lose power. You should be prepared for at least probably about a month for prolonged emergencies. Anything longer than a month to 3 months, you're probably going to have to move and evacuate. And like I said, you can't take that all with you. Your car can only hold so much. Then what do you do about gasoline if there's no gas in the area and your car runs out of gas? Electric vehicles, don't even get me started on electric vehicles. Right now, our electric vehicle technology is not there. We do not have enough charging stations. And if the power goes out, how are you going to charge your car? With gasoline, you might be able to come across someone that'll have a gallon or two gas in their garage that you can put gas in your car and get you a little further along. You can put gas in containers, and if you watch any of the overlanders or camping channels, you see the roto packs on the side of their vehicles. So they're able to take gasoline with them. How do you take electricity with you to run your car? If you weigh down a car with supplies, you're not going to lose that much torque and that much miles per gallon. However, we have seen cars and trucks that the more weight you have, the less mileage. It goes down greatly. So let's say your electric vehicle can get 200 to 300 miles on one charge. The average right now is about, depending on the vehicle, who makes it, whether it's a hybrid or fully electric, is anywhere, technology as the time of this recording is 100 to 250 miles. As soon as you start putting weight in that, it goes down to 75 to 150 miles. The new Rivian truck was just recently rated for overlanding, and it does have a lot of positives, but the range on that right now is about 200 miles empty. And an overlander, he did not have a rooftop tent. He just basically had basic overlanding supplies. So a cart in the back, propane tanks, cookware, clothing, a few other things. That had dropped down from about 200 miles to about 175. As soon as he put the rooftop tent on it, it dropped down between 100 miles to 150 miles. So those things that you're going to start thinking about, especially when you get out into these remote areas. Where is your next station? If a place gets flooded out, you are not going to be able to charge your electric vehicles. If power gets knocked out, you are not going to be able to charge your electric vehicles. There are new vehicles coming out that can be solar charged, but that is still a slow process. So if you're in an emergency and you got to move quickly and you're low on power, let's say in a time of war and troops are advancing and you have to leave an area and troops keep advancing, or maybe the hurricane has decided to change course and it's now coming over your area and you are running low on fuel, are you going to be able to sit there 3 to 7 hours while your car is charging? Versus if you have a gas or a diesel powered, you can always bring gas or diesel with you. You can always find someone that maybe has a few cans or gallons of gas that you can fill up to get to the next place. You can always drop 5 to 10 gallons in your gas tank within a few minutes and hurry up and move. So electric vehicles are not really worth it. Yes, they might be great for the environment, but I'm not going to get into the whole what it's doing to our earth to mine for the lithium and these giant, huge batteries they're going to put in these cars. And guess what? That is being mined by trucks run on diesel to keep up production. Technology may be all that great, but we also got to start thinking, about preparing. Truthfully, if you're going to be a prepper, like I said, have a week to 3 to 4 months supply on hand so that you can easily carry with you. Have a couple books, stock up on knowledge about how to do things out in the bush, out in the woods, like being able to start a fire to keep warm, to be able to protect yourself from the elements, what to do if you break a bone and you cannot get to the hospital, how to set a splint out in the field, how to bandage with whatever's around you. It doesn't really have to be all that clean. You can clean yourself up later. You can deal with an infection later, but you need to stop bleeding. And I just got my stitches out today. If you saw in my last podcast, I got 4 stitches in my hand. Truthfully, from now on, I am going to carry Stop Bleed with me. Whether it be the wipes or actually the powder that you dump in there. I should have had it on me, but I was in the city. I wasn't prepared. I had taken all the first aid packs out of my vehicle. Actually, we had my wife's vehicle, so we didn't even have first aid packs in there, but I took mine out of my vehicle for the winter to keep stuff from freezing and such. But people used to laugh at people that had what they were called get home bags or bug out bags that had the basic supplies that you could carry. In a way, I am all for that for emergencies that come along. But like I said, whatever you have, you got to be able to carry. And ultimately, your faith is going to come down to relying on God. What do you do afterwards? What do you do with all these supplies that get wiped out? Ultimately, it's going to come down to rely on God. So why not rely on God up front for your provisions? Why not let Him guide you properly about proper needs versus stockpiling and hoarding? Surround yourself with godly people. There are plenty of places and a lot of churches, a lot of fire departments that will teach you about basic first aid. That will teach you about faith and the right words and comforting to calm someone down in emergency, because getting hysterical is not going to help the situation. And yes, people are going to have to be comforted in times of sorrow and in hurt. Prepare yourself that way. Let God prepare you and provide your provision in your heart. Let God guide you and give you the knowledge that you need. Let God supply your needs. Relying on yourself is not gonna totally work. I've been there. I've tried relying on myself. I've tried, they always tell, especially us men, stand up, be a man, provide for yourself, don't rely on other people. It doesn't work. It does not work. There are times that come into your life when you've hit rock bottom, either spiritually, financially, or everything gets wiped out. Well, you will have no choice but to ask God what to do. You will have no choice but to turn to your neighbor, a parent, or a sibling, and be like, look, I'm without resources. God told me to come to you, and how can you help me? And the same thing goes true with them. If you see somebody hurting, go to them. Let God talk to you and be like, oh yes. Let God remind you, oh yes, I have this. Go get that, bring it to your neighbor. God does provide for your needs. I have seen checks come in when I have had absolutely no money and not sure where I'm going to get the money from for things like car repairs or food or medical bills or rent payment or electrics or whatever. God provided. Whether that be somebody we don't know giving a tip while working, whether that be just somebody handing us money saying, God told me to provide for you, whether this be somebody offering a hot meal, whether this be. And I've got a miracle story that I'm going to close with. So, a friend of mine, I'm not going to name him in this podcast out of privacy reasons, and if he wants to later on share his story, I will let him do that. So, this is all about God's provision. And while it has really nothing to do with preparing for emergencies, it does have to do with God providing for a need or a want, and especially something that God really wanted to bless his life with. So, this person that I know really wanted to go to a conference. And the situation he was in, he was not really sure about the cost of being able to go. Now, I will say up front, as far as I know, the conference itself was free, but there was the transportation on how to get there. There was how he was going to eat and where he was going to sleep at night, even though he thought about making believe he was reading or whatever and actually sleeping in the lobby of the hotel. But, so here's the thing. He booked Airbnb, but it wasn't through Airbnb. It was through another company. I think it was Verbo or maybe one other ones. But it was the one where instead of renting like a whole house or an apartment, basically you would rent a room for that time inside house or apartment, and of course there'd be other people who were renting. And so he had booked it, and they took the money out of his account. He got a call from the property owner, and the property owner said, "Oh no, you need to cancel. That room is not available." And he's like, "Well, my money was taken and it was given to you." And the guy was like, "Well, yeah, I'll have to see about refunding your money, blah, 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 blah." And he said, "But you need to do that cancellation." So he got into the terms and agreement. He found a clause at the bottom where it said if he was the one to cancel, all money would be forfeited, even though it was the other guy's mistake in either not taking it off the listing because he had been fully booked or whatever. But if he was to cancel, he would lose all the money. So he contacted the company, and I'm just going to use the name Verbo. I'm not even sure. Vacation Rentals by Owner. I'm not even sure if that's the one truly he went through, or if he went through Airbnb or one of the other ones. But so he contacted the company. He said, "Look, this is the situation." So the company backed him up on that, but they said, "Yes, we have to get the money from the guy first," and that could take a while. So came time for his trip. His mom said, "Look, just take my credit card and go. Take whatever you need." He didn't feel comfortable doing that, knowing his mom's resources, but he was like, "Okay, for if I need an emergency, I'll take your card and go while waiting for this refund." So he ended up booking a way to get to the conference. He was going to go via train and then take the ferry. So he went via train, got down to where the ferry was, and he was getting ready to take the ferry across the bay, got on the boat, and he was sitting there praying, and this guy came up to him and tapped him on the shoulder, and he started talking with the guy, and the guy said, "I'm a believer in Jesus Christ. For some reason, God told me that you need this," and handed him some money, and it was $500. Basically, paid for the ferry, paid for the train, and gave him a little extra money. And at first, my friend was flabbergasted. He didn't, basically it was like, "Are you sure? I don't know if I can accept this." And the guy's like, no, God told me to give this to you. And he goes, "Furthermore, when we get off the ferry, God told me to give you a ride to where you were going." So my friend was totally unsure, but he was like, "Okay, well, what's the worst that can happen if this is God?" So God gave him a ride to the hotel, and he didn't even have a room booked for the night. So he got to the hotel, and they went in, and the guy took off for a couple minutes. He went up to the desk, and he came back and he said, "I just paid for your room conference that you're going to." So not only did the guy give him $500, He paid for his room and he gave him a ride from the ferry drop off to the hotel. So my friend was like greatly thankful, and I don't know if he still keeps in contact with this guy or not, but he just said it had to be an angel. He just could not believe it, and he cries every time he shares the story. So the other miracle that happened while he was there, the conference went for 3 days, which basically meant it was 2 nights in the hotel. And the first night was paid for by the guy. And my friend really wanted to stay for the third day, but he wasn't really sure where he was going to, if he was going to be able to, whether he was going to, fake sleeping in the lobby or not. And as he got to meet people at the conference, he found out that there was a guy who was attending the conference who was from the same town that my friend was from, basically from the same city, and literally lived only like a few miles down the road. And, so my friend got to tell him, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to stay and everything. And he's like, well, he goes, I got a story for you. He goes, I don't know why, but when I checked into the hotel, they gave me a suite with kind of an extra bedroom with an extra bed, or kind of like around the corner. And I told him that there was a mistake, that I did not book this room, and they said no, this is your room, and that's the going to be the cost, which is what you originally booked for, and here's the keys. He goes, I didn't know why God was doing this up front, but he goes, I guess it was so that you could have a place to sleep tonight comfortably and attend the third day of the conference. So my friend was like totally shocked. He's like, okay, first the blessings happen of this guy, this stranger giving me money, giving me a ride, and paying for my first night in the hotel. Then at the conference, I meet somebody who's from my own city and lives only a couple miles away, who offers me a room for the second night, has an extra bed. And not only that, the guy said, rather than paying for your way home, he goes, I drove to this conference and I put my car on the ferry, and that's how I'm going back. Rather than you trying to, find the ferry, bus ride, or whatever, he goes, why don't I just give you a ride back? Why don't I just give you a ride back? My friend's entire weekend and conference was provided for by God through a complete stranger, through a guy maybe he's seen once or twice around town, who was at the conference and everything. So if there's a need, God's going to provide. And we need to learn that. We need to totally learn to be about God's provision. Yes, it's nice to prepare. Yes, it's nice to be ready. But ultimately, your needs are going to be met by God at the specific time you need it. So, to me, I say don't waste your money on prepping. Be a good steward first, because if you sow into charity, if you were tithe, now people going back and forth whether or not the tithe is still biblical. Well, the New Testament talks about giving and offerings more than it talks about tithe. Tithe was an Old Testament law of 10%. New Testament is about giving, stewardship, and offerings. So if you do that, God said, test me. I'm going to provide for you. So my friend does a lot of that. He does a lot of giving. And he's always been provided for. He's always, had blessings. I've seen the blessings come in my life. So that's kind of ultimately, between the Bible verses, my own experience, what I've seen, miracles and others, why I don't long-term prep anymore. I've seen resources in my own life get wasted as they were sitting around, and then I later discovered that food went out of date, water leaked, I had tools that rust. I've seen clothes get moldy, stain, moth eaten. The Bible also talks about, moth and rust come in and destroy, rats eating the grain. I have seen places, and I lived in places that had a mice infestation, and they start getting into your dry goods. If you go back to biblical times, or even today, or especially if you live down in the south, you get these like bugs that get into your grains and stuff. Can't think of the proper word right now. So, you got to be careful how you store that. Glass jars break, vinegar rust stuff. Long-term prepping is really not the answer. Being prepared and ready for an emergency on the short term and then relying on God for the rest is the answer. Rely on God's provisions. Take that focus off of yourself and put it on God. Let God meet your needs, because you're going to find also over time that your needs are going to change. I could be storing up batteries, double A's, triple A's, but as technology changes, so aren't my needs. I'm not so much into the double A's and triple A's. I'm into these bigger, what they call silent generators of battery packs that last longer than that. That can also be recharged and reused via the sun and solar power. Also, the flashlights that I had used to require replacement of bulbs that you cannot find anymore that actually burnt your batteries down quicker. Now, even these lights that I'm using here in my studio are LED, and they're less voltage and a lot bright. They can be run off of batteries, or they can actually be hooked if you have a solar panel that has a USB port and run straight off of solar. So technology is going to change. So why hoard stuff for technology is changing? And also, if you're going to stock up using your latest technology or technology you see in the future, like the LED USB lights, your USB battery packs, your stuff that runs on low voltage electricities. What happens if an EMP comes and all that electronics is destroyed and you're back to living in the 16 and 1700s, relying on candle power for light, fire to keep warm, burning oils and fats for a candle? All that new technology is wasted and gone. Electricity, things that are electrical, like I said, battery packs and all that, a lot of that stuff is not even waterproof. So how are you going to store that? As soon as moisture gets wet, boom, destroys that. So why bother stocking up? A lot of people, talk about butane and isobutane because it's cheap. Do you know anything that has a butane mixture in it does not work below freezing? So on a day like today, if I'm stuck outside, I could not cook. I could not keep warm. I'd have to find a way to warm that canister up for us. And then doesn't get too cold and turn into a liquid. Propane, on the other hand, will get down to negative 45 degrees. Some of them, the bottles can get down to negative 100 degrees, and I'm talking Fahrenheit. I'm in America. I'm not on the metric scale, so I'm not talking Celsius. I'm talking Fahrenheit. So things can drop down below freezing and get really below freezing, and propane will still work. It may not work 100%, but it will still work. So how are you prepping, and what are your prep needs? Blankets, got to make sure that they're dry if they're going to work properly. Wet blankets not going to work good. Clothing, you got to have dry clothing. So what are you prepping for? What's the technology? What happens if that technology no longer exists? So you just spent $800 on solar power and batteries and all that, and then boom, you get hit with an EMP and all the electronics is destroyed, or a hurricane happens and the stuff gets wet, and the moisture and the wetness destroys all your electronics. You have nothing now, and you have to go back to relying on like you're in the 16 and 1700s. What happens if a forest fire comes through and you cannot cook because all the wood is gone? You cannot keep warm, you cannot light a fire because all the wood in your area is gone. A forest fire. A lot of unanswered questions, a lot of things you got to think of. I would rather be ready for, if something was to happen today and now, based on my knowledge, how am I going to react to that situation? How am I going to rely on God? Where is God going to lead me to protect me and provide me for? A lot of these preppers and a lot of these outdoor people are talking about the same thing over and over again about all these long-time preps. God gave us his word in Luke 12:20 to 24. I'm going to close out with these verses. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens, in other words, the birds. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And if you ever seen a bird or a bird's nest, you know that there's no extra food in there. They are out getting food every day. And like in the Old Testament, when they were out in the wilderness for 40 years and they were crying for food, God provided manna from heaven. It came down and they were to collect only for that day. If they had any more left over the next day, it was rotten. Same thing with long-term prepping. If you have it for long term, it will rot. So God provided day by day. He provided that day. He provided the need for that day. He provided the meal for that day. They were to only collect for that day, and then God would provide for the next day. So this is where it gets also into about the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much valuable you are than the birds. Jesus encourages his followers to trust in God's provision, illustrating that if God cares for the birds, he will certainly care for us. I'm going to leave you with that today, talking about being prepared for emergencies and good stewards versus being a prepper, being a hoarder, and taking your reliance off of God. So I'm going to leave that for you today to ponder and to think about. My hope and prayer is that we do not see any of the emergencies, that God will always protect us. My hope and prayer is that if something does come, God will provide for me and care for me like it says in his word and like he has shown me a number of times, and that he will give me direction on what I need and where to go. Because as I'm getting older, I need to rely more on that, because as I get older and my body gets weaker and doesn't function like it used to just because of age setting in, I cannot carry, in past injuries, I cannot carry everything that I used to be able to carry when I was 20 years old. It shows these military people, and if you watch the movies, and even people I know have been in the military, they train with these 100 to 200 pound packs. But when they're out in the field fighting, the first thing that happens is you're not going to need this, you're not going to need this, you're not going to need this, you're not going to need this. They have the bare basic necessities on them, their rifle or whatever, so that they're able to move quickly and rely on each other. Same thing with God. If something happens, this is not going to be good, this is not going to be good, this is not going to be good. Move quickly, rely on God, provide for each other, provide for your fellow man will watch out for you. It's just some things to ponder about being, whether you're going to be a prepper or whether you're going to lead a life of peace, not worry. And that's the other thing. Being a prepper brings a lot of worry. You have worry, that's why you're prepping. You're worried this is going to happen. I'd rather have the peace of God in my heart and not worry. Not worry about the future, knowing God's going to provide for me. Maybe I'm not going to have all the riches that I have now, depending on what level you consider riches, but I will always have my needs met. And then spiritually, a lot of people have found out, that's why there's a lot of people live in minimalist lifestyles, that less is more. And as I go through my outdoor gear and my downsizing and everything, I'm finding out that I need less in life as I get older. I need less. Less makes me happy. I don't have to worry about the proper storage. I don't have to worry about maintenance. I don't have to worry about things spoiling. God gives me what I need when I need it. I just don't worry about that anymore. Prepping is based out of worry. I'm not going to have enough food. I'm not going to have enough money. I'm not going to have enough resources. I'm not going to have enough heat. I'm not going to have enough. No. God's peace is, and God's provision is, he will provide at that time. Yes, be prepared for the short term so that you can properly react when something happens, but God will provide. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to close this podcast. I just pray that everything is going well for you in the beginning part of 2025. I know some people were given messages and visions that they're going to be stretched this year. God's going to stretch them. which basically means it's going to cause you to rely more on God as things come in your life, as you're called to do more things. So, I pray that if you are being stretched and this is a season where you need to really think about things and be stretched, that you put your total faith and contentment in God and Jesus Christ. It's the only way. It's the only way. It's the only thing we can do. The future, there is no certainty. We don't know what's going to happen the next hour from now. We don't know what's going to happen the next month. We don't know what's going to happen the next year. Yes, we can see the signs out on the horizon of things that might come, but whether they truly come or not, we don't know, because we know worry is 90% worrying about the things that don't happen. I'll leave you with that. Have a good and blessed week, and we'll see you in the next episode.